Okay, so here we are. We're in our sort of improv spray area. Now, as I said before, I've got a spray bay just down here, okay? And usually I can get sort of a small 132nd aircraft into it, or certainly 148s and things like that. But because of this one, and I want to show you exactly what we're doing, I've decided to do it right here. Now, we're going to have to talk about it. A bit of health and safety here. On a kit this size, especially when you're doing a lot of spray work, we're going to get a lot going airborne, okay? Even though these are acrylics and not as nasty as obviously using enamels or lacquer based and things like that, they're still pretty nasty, especially in a confined space, especially if you haven't got ventilation. So a mask is a bit of a must. Now, as I said, you can spend a fortune on masks or you can do it relatively cheap. This one is quite a cheap one, in all honesty. It's got one air filter. I don't know much about it, if I'm honest, but it does do the trick, and I use it mainly for doing resin. As I said, I've got a Graphic Air very large extractor over here, which has got an exhaust system which goes around and then goes basically out the window out over the side. Okay, now the thing is that does draw out probably 90% of here. If you haven't, for goodness sake, make sure you're in a very well ventilated area, okay, and you've got plenty of windows open and a door with a through draft. Just don't open a window. You need to get the through draft sort of going. If it's warm where you are, perhaps it's better to spray outdoors. For the purpose of doing this one, I've got a Harder and Steenbeck Evolution airbrush. This is a dual action airbrush. It's gravity fed because obviously it comes from the top going down. Dual action basically means air, you push down. I won't point it at me whilst it. Push down gives you air, you pull back, it gives you your paint. Between the two, you can have a nice balance. This particular airbrush comes with a standard 0.2mm needle on it. Very fine, good enough for doing camo work and quite broad areas, as you're going to see in a moment when we start doing big areas of paint, especially the grey underneath. I'm going to be using acrylic paints, and to be honest, I'm going to be using the Guns range. These are the acrylic ones that they do because, well, quite frankly, the only ones who do decent Israeli colours in them. And for the purpose of it, I'm going to be using Tamiya X20A acrylics. Now, my compressor I've got down the bottom is basically, it's a 2 litre, got a tank on it as well, so I can spray without it kicking in, although you will notice as soon as I start spraying, you know, it's going to make a bit of a racket anyway. So anyway, to start with, I'm just going to use some Tamiya black, flat black. Now, this is what we spoke about when we were masking up this canopy area, okay? All we're going to do is spray. Check our flows coming through, okay? We're just going to spray the canopy. Now the reason for this is, it's so from the inside it shows through black, okay? So it doesn't have to be a precise job, but what we're going to do is make sure you've covered it all properly so it does show black. The other thing this does very nicely, will give you a black line running around the inside, and it works quite well, okay? So let's do this side as well. Okay, now whilst you've got the black paint out, you might want to check some little areas where you're not quite sure about how it's actually, the joins are and things like that. In my case, the only one I'm slightly concerned about is the nose. Now I know we're obviously going to go around and do this in priming, so we'll be able to have a look. But I want to just pop around now and see how it looks, because it was had to have a bit of a sand job, but by looking at it when it's slightly wet, even now, you can see it's a good one. You don't have to worry about it, but if it was a problem, I could literally let that dry, sand it, do it, whatever. Okay, so we're going to do the same with a few other things. We're just going to check the wing joins to see how they look really with some paint on it. We'll do both of those, because that's the only other area I'm slightly concerned about. And then what I'm going to do is same on the underside. This is all going to be lost. Don't worry about any of this because it's going to be lost. But what you can do is you can check it. If it doesn't look right, if you sand it, you can see exactly where you are because of the black areas you've done on it. But quite frankly, we're very happy how they've turned out, all of them. Okay, so we're going to let this dry off just for a moment, and then we're going to get some primer together. Now, primer, again, you could literally go off and buy a can of primer. Most of the manufacturers, hobby ones, I'm thinking here, Tamiya, Guns, things like that, do a actual primer. You can buy and spray it on. Comes in a rattle can and you can spray it all over it. Yeah, that's great. I don't mind doing it, but I tend to find rattle cans go everywhere, absolutely everywhere. So I prefer to use the airbrush, again, purely because I can get it in and out of the room. What I tend to do is literally pick a neutral colour, i.e. a grey, something light. I have been known even to prime up in green and things like that in the past. But literally something like, if we take what we've got a lot of, and I'm literally just looking to see what we've got a lot of, but a type of grey. Quick tip here, if you ever get a top won't come off, guns do this set, okay? It's 2 rings. One ring fits perfectly over Tamiya bottles, as in this, and the rubber one you sit underneath and it just grips everything. And it is so much easier for getting tops off, okay? And you can have a look, and I haven't got much in there, so we won't bother with that. Okay, we'll pick another one. But also, the great thing about it is, if you take it over to the Mr. Hobby range, the smaller end, he says, I've got the wrong one on. Yeah, sorry, wrong end on. Does these. Okay, so that's the tops off of that one, although it's left the bottom in. Alright, and then the other great thing about them is, if you've got their metalizer range with these flat tops, got a little T-section in there, it sits on the top like that, and unscrew it, okay, and that undoes those caps. So instead of doing it the old way of tearing up the inside of your hand and everything else, these for £5, bargain. Well worth the investment. Anyway, I digress. So we're letting that dry. So what we're trying to do now is find some grey. So we'll just see what we've got a lot of. I seem to have a lot of this. This will do. We're using XF22, which is actually German grey, RLM grey. Okay. So what we do, we give this a good old shake, because I haven't used it for absolute ages. Again, it just shows it's stuck. But I tell you what, it's a great tool for this. It's one of those ones, whoever invented it needs a pat on the back. Now, I haven't got much in here, and it's very old. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take 5mm of thinners. I'm going to pop probably just a tiny bit more, 6mm of thinners into this. Okay, then I've got a mixing brush just down here, and we're just going to mix it in the bottle, because I'm going to use all of this on this lot. Okay, so we just give this around, and this is great for getting rid of old paint like this, you know, because you can have bottles of paint that kick around your desk, because we've all got them, and you open them up and they're absolutely horrible, so you might as well use them up. Okay, so we just give that a good old mix. So we've got plenty of lumps in this, which isn't the best thing. So if you have got loads of lumps in your paintwork, just like this, this is a little thing I did in a show a while ago. I did a quick intro show. Keep mixing will get rid of obviously a lot of it, but what you can do, you can make up something like this. Now this is literally a plastic bottle. It's one of the wash bottles. Okay, I've cut off the end, and we've just got a piece of tight or stocking around it, okay, and then literally all we've got is a rubber band holding it on. Then before we put it into our paintbrush, we will filter it. Now the great thing I like about these, because it fits very nicely into the top of a colour cup. So we've got a little bit of black paint in here, so we're just going to blow it out and get rid of it all. I'm not even going to worry about colour change or anything like that, because we won't be around long enough to know about it. So we just give it a scrub. So we just hold that there, and then what we'll do, we'll just pour this straight in here. And hopefully what that will do is catch all the nasties in the civvy bit. We'll just pop that out of the way, and there it goes. It sits on there like this. Should have thought about this really and had some more bits ready. Okay, so in here we've got about 2mm sat in. Just going to blow the black out, and we come through to this colour. And then what we'll do, just for the moment, just making sure we didn't put a fingerprint in that, we will start on the underside. So what I'm going to do, just pop this in here, and just for the minute so I walk you through it, I'll do it without anything running. So what we're going to do, we've checked our flow, we're quite happy how it is. I'm shooting this at around about 35 psi, so a nice high air pressure, and we are literally putting on a dusty coat quite a thin one, and just walking it across, okay? We're not worried about getting in here too much at the moment in detail, because literally this is a primer. The purpose of a primer, two things. Firstly, it's going to show up anything that's wrong. If you've got any lines, joints, glue marks, anything else, if you can see it now, you're going to see it later on, so it's well worth taking care of it now. Second thing it'll do, it'll make your next coat of paint grip to it far, far easier. So what we do, we just roll this everywhere on the model, so we're all going to turn a nice shade of green. Okay, and cover up that black that we had on there as well. And obviously all of those paints we had on the go, you know, that were used for checking seam lines or filler and things like that, they're all go now as well. Now the engine, you might notice I haven't masked up, that's because I'm going to shoot it from behind like this. Okay, and we're just going to walk this up. Make sure you get in all the areas. Okay. But say, don't worry about it too much. It's literally a primer. Alright. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to finish off priming the rest of it. I'm also going to do all the tanks and the pylons you can see up here, all with primers, so we're sat in there. So now I can get the extractor on, the window open, and away we go. Okay, so as you can see, we are all pre-shaded and nicely done. Now, you might see the underside here is quite green, okay? This is because we used that, the FX colour, the German grey under here. But for the top side, I actually went with a lighter shade. So I had some XF20 kicking round, so I gave it a quick blow over that, purely because we've got sand colours, very light colours, and I don't want them to be darkened down, because obviously what happens is if you've got a dark colour underneath, that will show through. I know a lot of people like to prime with white and things like that. I don't really go along with white too much, but I do like the greys. XF20 is a nice colour for it. Basically it's light gold grey. So there we go, so all done. So we can go around and we can look at things like I'll get the lighting on here, but you can see things like panel lines down here with these wing joints. We weren't quite sure how they were going to look, but certainly I'm really happy with the way that they've turned out. Both sides, no problems at all. We've got some of the gaps we were worried about where the actual this intake system fits in. Happy with those. Also little things as well where flaps join, obviously because you've got glue marks that you might be worried about. We want them to be quite sharp and crisp and to have lines running down there. Same with the fins, obviously important ones to make sure you've got no gaps. Also the thing we're looking for is, we spoke about quite a while ago now, but glue marks where you get that little pin marks in there, little air bubble marks, make sure they're all gone, and that's really where the Mr. Surfacer comes into its own and takes care of it. Obviously the big one to make sure is that the tail is sat on here, and we have got a small little mark just down in there. Now it's one of those ones where I'm thinking maybe we'll get the Mr. Surfacer out and do it again, but on the other hand I'm thinking it's not going to be that noticeable because there should be a mark between the two, but it's something I think we'll have a look at a bit more closely. But certainly again we wanted to make sure these wing joints, and they're probably the most noticeable ones there are. The nose section where we put this on, obviously we did a little bit of sanding, we want to make sure, as again all the lumps and bumps are looking like they're supposed to be part of it and not really stuck on like an afterthought. And obviously the saddle tanks, we were happy with the way they went on originally, but we're just making sure. So really it's just a look over, because right now, easy enough, sand, fill, rescribe any panel lines you need to put in, all those bits and pieces can be done right now with minimal effort whatsoever, because all you do is come along and just blow over the area with the pre-shading again. Now it looks quite patchy and blotchy. This is because the lighter coat we put on the top was a very thin coat. I literally just misted it over and it looked very wet when it went on. Same as we did, obviously, all the pylons, we're looking for those same things as well. Don't just think it's just the model, you want to make sure all the little bits look good as well. Certainly right the way through to the pylons, making sure you've got no seam lines running through them, making sure there's no gaps and any nasty bits showing up, perhaps sanding marks, things like that, we want those to be gone. And then obviously that goes all the way down to these big fuel tanks. We're looking to see how these power lines are still looking, if they're still looking good, or perhaps they're looking a little bit ropey, but as you can see, they're all looking very nice. We've got no obvious seam line. The seam line would be down the front here, so we're looking for sink marks, perhaps little gaps between where power lines are, and certainly for the belly, we want them to all look so it's seamless, so it all looks like it's in one. Exactly the same for everything else you do. So pre-shading, you know, things like that, that when they're going to go on next are going to be really start of it. So at the moment, when you've done your primer, if it looks good in primer, it will look good when your paintwork's all done. So what we're going to do now is the way of the ring. So we're going to start by doing pre-shading. All pre-shading is a way of adding staining or shadows to your model. This is great for when you're doing especially underside areas like this, because what will happen is that when we go along with the grey will fade in. Now it's a two-stage process. By putting in black lines, following all the panel lines and all the bits and pieces under here, what that actually does is when the grey goes on, it gives a shadow between them. It helps break up the blockiness of the grey. If we just painted this grey, it would look like a brick, okay? We need to break it up. This will break it up. Also, when it comes to putting a wash on, as we'll do afterwards, this grey area will act as a way of accentuating the panel line. So instead of the panel lines looking like a grid running everywhere down, if you had a wash on, it will just help them blend in, and it just gives it that overall diversion to the eye to make it all seem to flow, all very realistic. And obviously you can go around and lighten and fade paint as we're going to do on this as well, but certainly post shading, especially on greys, is quite important. Camo, you don't tend to get it as much. You tend to lose post shading because when you go around, you put it on, then you put your colours on and colours on and colours on, and it usually gets lost. So some ways post shading, and really that's when the paintwork is all on and you're all finished, and you go along and mist in fine coats and put it on that way. You can do it afterwards. The only trouble doing afterwards is it's a bit of a one-way thing. You can easily ruin it and go over the top. Pre-shading, putting it on first, if you don't like it, just go right over it with your colour and start afresh with it. So what we're going to do now, we're just going to take some XF1 flat black, okay, airbrush, exactly the same setup as we had for doing the primer coats on there. Okay, so we've got a little bit of flat black in here. We're not going to overly thin this. We're not going to go into, we want it like water. We just want it a little bit more. So we just use a brush to mix them together. Okay, now as I say, keep it quite thick. Don't go in there too thin. So it's probably only, it's not a 50-50 mix. It's probably 3/4 paint to about sort of a quarter thinner. So we'll just test it over here. Okay, all happy how that's going to be. So we're going to do it on the underside. So we just pop this down, put it to a nice comfy angle of how you want it. A little tip is, you know, you see the old films where they have two-hand grip on the gun to steady it, exactly the same. I tend to put my elbow, if I bring you out a little bit, I put my elbow up against the table like this, okay, forearm lying across it like this, and that way you can get in nice and precise and just hold it round. I must admit, I can't do freehand totally like this. I'm not that steady with it, so I tend to put my hand in and like this. Big thing is make sure you've got smooth paint flow. You don't want to be in a situation where it's spitting, stopping, starting, thick bits, thin bits, okay? Air pressure, get your air pressure right up there. She's just pressurized up at 30, probably 8 psi, very high air pressure. So the paintwork's quite thick, so by higher air pressure, it's atomizing it and getting it to go on. So what we're going to do, we are just going to follow down. Okay, and just work our way up and down. Big panel line, because it's a big area. Okay, so this is going to be an actuator. Obviously you've got the forward flaps here, okay, and obviously they're going to droop, they're going to come upwards and everything else. They're going to attract a lot of dirt, same as the flapperons down the back here. They're going to get a lot back end around the aircraft. Little areas perhaps where you've just got some fine panel lines, especially around the nose area, things like that, are going to get little bits, okay, but all this will do is hopefully break it up a little bit. So we're going to go in with the heavy ones first. Okay, if it's looking too wet, come away, just push for air and dry it down from a distance. Don't go in too tight because you'll make it spider leg and it will go everywhere, okay? So we're going to put quite a large one down in here on the wing joint, and we're going to do a slightly lighter one on this area here, because we've got a panel line here, but it's nothing massive. And then obviously this pylon join, where it joins. Now, we've got hatches and little screw bolts all down here. So I'm going to actually spray in the hatches. Okay, now there's a few little bolts down here around where we've actually got the wing join onto the model. Now I'm not too worried about those, if we just bring you in a little bit, okay, because obviously we've got the pylons are going to fit onto there and going to cover them up, but we're doing these around it so it gives a little bit of fading. You'll see it around, perhaps it's had a touch up, little things like that. Okay, so what we'll do now is we'll start our way, if we just move the light over a little bit, we're going to start our way around the model. Okay, so to start with, we're just going to come up around the door area here. Okay, we've got lots of panel lines and interesting things going on down here. Now remember, there's no such thing as a straight piece of dirt, okay? So don't worry if you've got a slight wobble. In some ways, it's better. And I say this all the time because I get a lot of people asking me about, oh, I'm not very good at my airbrushing, I couldn't possibly do this. Trust me, you don't want it to be perfect. If each of these lines were exactly the same, when it comes to painting, you would see them underneath and it would look like a grid. We don't want it to be that. We want it to be faded. We want it to be wobbly. We want it to be thicker and then go thinner and then thicker again, things like that. That way, it really just blends it all through. If you do it too precise and too sharp, you can end up with it looking a complete mess because it looks like a grid underneath the paintwork. We're trying to keep this as natural as possible by fading colours in and things like that. We've got some various hatches along the bottom here, so I'm actually going to spray those whole. Okay, I'm just going to paint those actually over the top. And what it'll do, it'll just look like you've got dirt attracted around those areas. So we've got power lines running down here. Running down in here, and because this panel line just down in here is very close to the edge, I'm going to spray on the inside of it only, because the thing is, if I spray on the outside you won't really notice the panel line. Hopefully you'll still see a little bit through it. So we've got a nice big panel line running around here, so we're going to give that lots of paint. Also, we know it's down the engine half and they always tend to be a little bit more mucky. That's down the back here, so plenty in there. Okay, now what I'm going to have to do is swing this away. Big hatches, we're just going to do around the outside of them. Now, some of these, we're going to be painting these up as well, are going to go metal colours, so it will just add to the outside of it. It'll be nice and metally in the middle, and on the outside it looks like heat marks around it, all those things. So there's a big one down the middle here. Centre pylon, gear doors. Two things happen. If you go the geared door like we've done here, make sure they're almost together, but you'll get a little bit of overspray goes through, just adds to a little bit of weathering on the inside. So this one here, we'll just push it together a little bit. Okay, just like that. We'll just tilt it over now, and we're going to do down in here. Okay, we've got a little panel line just down here, one down here. Panels. And that's all you're going to be doing, is going around everywhere. But as I said, don't worry about it. If it all looks a little bit messy, you can obviously come back, pre-shade, do it all again and things like that. So I'm going to work my way around using that technique right the way around the entire aircraft. At the same time, I'm going to do all the fuel tanks and all the other bits, the weapons pylons, all those areas, so we're all done. Tail planes as well, everything else, so we're all completely pre-shaded. Right then, so we've gone right the way through, and as you can see, we're all pre-shaded. As I said before, don't worry about it if it's not very neat. You know, on camera this might look a little bit neat, but trust me, it's pretty blotchy. Some areas are heavier than others, and right the way through. So as I say, it doesn't have to be right. Make it random, and it will look a lot better as we move through. Now, for doing all the paint work, obviously there's various paints available on the market. As you know, I only use acrylics. And really, for doing certain manufacturers, shall we say, specialise in certain colours. One of the really nice paints, to be honest, is the Guns system. This is their Aquatis Hobby Colour. Okay, now they're an acrylic, but when we say they're acrylic, I think they're more like a synthetic acrylic. They're not like water in the true sense of the word of it. They're more like an enamel. They work like an enamel. They are super, super tough, very tough. A lot of acrylics, shall we just say, if we get a few, we got here the Valero colours. They tend to be an easy rub through. These tend to be more like water, water based. The smell of them and everything else. These tend to be quite smelly, and they sort of react and go on a lot more like enamel paint, which in some ways is quite nice. The only drawback to these, if you're using something like, as I say, the Tamiya, or you know, certain other manufacturers here, we got down here as well, we got extra acrylics. These ones here dry almost instantly. You know, you've probably just got a few minutes in it. These ones here, because they're more sort of chemically, I suppose, want for a better word, or definitely synthetic, they tend to take a lot longer to dry. So what you tend to get is the eggshell effect, as I call it, where it feels touch dry, no problem at all, but if you hold it, the heat from your fingers melts it slightly. Before you know it, you've got a fingerprint in it. So treat these a lot more like you treat an enamel paint, i.e. give it plenty of time between coats, don't mask them up unless it's totally necessary and things like that. So what we'll do is we're going to start off with a quick run through of the colours we're going to use. So we've got here for the Radome colour, which we're going to do very first one, we're going to be using just make sure I have got it right here. This is the H307. Okay, now this is the FS equivalent, which is FS36320. Okay, now what happens is radomes have a sort of texture to them to allow radar to pass back and forth, obviously, because obviously being a radome. The trouble with that is it gets extremely grubby. So if you put 10 F-16s in a row, chances are you get 10 different colours of nose, because they weather at different rates. And some of them have got quite old noses on perhaps, and they, you know, obviously weather up quite a lot, versus quite new, they tend to be lighter grey. So there's no real right and wrong, certainly, about colours of noses. So if we start with that for the moment, what we'll do, we'll give this a good old shake up. Now you can thin this with their own thinners, but I'm still going to be using the Tamiya X20A, because that thins it just as nicely. So if we can get the top off, we'll be alright. I haven't used this one before, so make sure it's had a good old mix. When you're doing proper paintwork, make sure your thinners goes in first. Now, as I said, because we're going to have this as quite a weathered nose for the radome, okay, we're going to make it quite thick, okay. That will give it more of a texture, a gritty texture, so when we come through the wash will stick quite nicely to it, giving it more of a grimy look. Overall, the aircraft's going to be very, very clean. So we'll just pour some bit of paint in there like that, and we'll just give this a mix up with the brush. Here, just like so. Okay, blow it through. Okay, holding on to it. And we're going to spray. Now, because we've got pre-shading down here, we don't want to obliterate it totally. We want it to fade it back. So we just spray the nose, and we're just going to do one light pass over it to start with. Over, working our way around. So what we want to happen really is for the pre-shading to disappear just under a very light coat. Then as it dries, with any luck, it comes back. So as it dries, don't worry if your pre-shading totally disappears just for a few moments, because what will happen is over the next 10 minutes, as it starts to dry, it should all come through. But what you want to try and do is keep it as even as possible. And just gently build up the layer, just like so. Okay, so we'll leave that just to dry off. Happy with how that's gone on. Okay, So obviously don't place it down. So what we're going to do, we're going to leave that for about half an hour, to be honest, just to go off completely, because then we can mask it up and then we can get on with the real mainstay of the painting with the underside grey and everything. But it's easier to do this first than it would afterwards, because this way we can put a little bit of Tamiya tape around the front. Okay, it's masked off, crimp it up, it will give us something to hold on to the model as well as we're doing the rest of it. Okay, and it saves that thing of having to mask up the front and then half the aircraft just to spray the front.